Hello and welcome to Ask GMBN Tech. This is the show where we can try and answer your questions about mountain bike tech. So if you've got your own question, please get it into the comments using the hashtag AskGMBNTech, and I promise I won't say tech again. Anyway, on with the show. So we had some really good questions in response to last week's show, and some of them were under similar veins, so I've grouped a couple together. So the first one is from MotoChester, and they say, does stanchion width make a difference? And if so, what does it change? The second question in a similar vein is from Doug, and they say, my Roscoe came with 120mm drilly fork with 30mm steel stanchions. I've seen other forks with large diameter stanchions, which are supposed to be stiffer, but mine are steel. Should I worry about the bigger diameter? Also, for the reference, I'm £275 if that makes any difference. They also note that aftermarket forks are really expensive. Well, aren't they just? Yes, they are quite expensive, and getting OE prices when it comes with the bike, is the cheaper way to do it, I suppose. But it really does make a difference, especially when you're extending forks. So when you're using them in a longer application, the thing is that you've got to think about is a term we call, bushing overlap. So what that means is the fork is a sliding surface moving through a bush, and as you get really, really long applications, the closer that bush is towards the end, well, the less stiff it's going to be. If you imagine it as anything really, if you were to have a bar and hang weight off it, depending where you hang the weight is drastically going to affect how much that bar flexes. So yes, it does matter. It just comes back down to leverage. The longer fork, the more leverage it's going to have, with your weight swinging off it. But it also comes up from the ground as well. The way you ride will have an impact. Stiff forks are great in any application, but when you're riding hard or indeed heavier, you will benefit from a stiffer fork exponentially. There's a lot of emphasis on the moment about going to larger forks, and a lot of people are reporting, great results and they're very happy, and that seems like definitely a good thing. I would still be very curious to see what happens with our head tubes, or if indeed there is another standard that might come through in the next year or two, or whether we're just treading water until we bolt on kind of a more triple clamp downhill fork, which isn't everyone's cup of tea. So I think it's really interesting. But yeah, definitely bigger forks that are stiffer do tend to work better under torsional load. The next question is from Colin, and they say, I recently purchased a second-hand mountain bike and I've noticed the rear linkage has a bit of play in it. Would there be a quick fix for this, and are there any solutions? Well, play, like real estate, is all about location. It's about tracking it down, and then you can work out how expensive it's going to be. What you're hoping for, in a way, is that there is the small amount of play. Well, ideally it just comes from things not being torqued correctly. Secondary to that, the cheapest option is going to be if there is a small amount of play in the bush where the shock connects. Normally there'll be one end more active than the other, usually kind of the lower link that's connected to the moving swing arm. So what you want to do is basically just hold your piece of your hand, or your finger, a piece of your hand, commonly described as a finger, against that, and just lift and unweight the bike, and that's going to make it move ever so slightly. And when you take it out, to the eye it might not actually be worn, but it's done to quite tight tolerances, and it doesn't have to be worn much for it to cause a bit of knocking or a bit of play. And once that's either fixed it or not, work around the bike and go between each pivot, and hopefully you should be able to track it down relatively easily. A big thing you want to be doing when you're trying to detect play is just kind of lifting up the bike, and if there is a bit of play, then it will be kind of in two steps, because you'll be lifting up the that kind of, say it was the handlebars for a headset, you'll be lifting up the handlebars, and then there'll be a bit of play as you just lift it off the ground, as the rest of the bike and the flex kind of catches up. But yeah, I hope that answers your question. The next question is from Jim, and they say they have a RockShox Raber, probably about 2008, and under heavy braking it makes a fairly loud creaking noise. They've fully stripped down the headset and it hasn't fixed anything, so they're thinking, could it be the forks? But they've been serviced relatively recently, so they hope that isn't it. It sounds as if there is a creak in your crown stereo unit, your CSU. Now the best way to check for this, it's relatively simple. You want to just find like a curb, like a normal pavement curb, and ride off it and pop the front wheel up so you land rear wheel first. because when you then land the front wheel, it's going to try and extend the wheelbase. And then you turn around and you ride back into it, and you want to ride without lifting up the front wheel, and so it hits the wheel in such a way that it's going to try and shorten your wheelbase. Because what can happen is they crack when they go the wrong way, and then they settle. And it's not until you get a force going in the other direction and it pushes it back the other way and it cracks again. Now, obviously this isn't what you want, and in an extreme case, it could fatigue to such a point where it snaps off. That being said, it's not totally uncommon to have creaking forks, and you can do you can replace the uppers, for instance, or indeed a more experimental but less watertight fix would be to turn the fork upside down in a vise and just drip some retaining compound and maybe heat it slightly and try and get it in all the areas. That might silence it, but it's obviously not going to take care of any potential component failure issues, and it's not going to prevent that. It's only going to quieten it down. Also, the tubes themselves are pressed into the upper as well, and sometimes they can creak. So making sure that the top caps are torqued correctly can actually affect that as well on some models. The next question is from Xander, and they say they've got a pair of Tektro Orion 4-pot brakes on my giant trans. My brakes have never felt the same from the beginning, as they always feel spongy and about 1.5 centimeters from clamping the bars. I bled the brakes and changed the rotors and pads, and even given it a full service check, and they still seem to feel spongy. What you can sometimes get is, a manufacturer might spec quite long lever blades on the actual lever themselves, and this is to basically increase the amount of leverage, and which will drastically increase power. However, sometimes the larger the lever, the more spongy it feels and the less bite you have. If you have a very small lever, because it's essentially less effective, it feels far more positive. So it's a balancing act between positive feel and actual power. If you ever try with some Maguras, they come, you can swap out the lever lengths to suit, and it's a rider preference. But some people find that it's actually, they put the shorter lever on, and they do feel maybe more positive, but they don't quite have the power. Similarly, the longer lever gives them lots and lots of power, but they have to accept that it's a trade-off and it's a compromise, like many setup choices on our bikes. And I think it's cool that with a company such as Magura, you actually have that option. You've also got to think of it like, it's the same as anything. We're going to come on to how our suspension works later on, but it's a similar sort of thing. How much leverage is being actuated depends on whether that varies through the stroke, and of course it doesn't, because it's fixated at one point. So it's going to be very linear. And so what that means is, as you go through the stroke of the lever blade, it's going to be wanting to move the same amount of oil independent of where it is in the stroke. I mean, it might even actually be slightly regressive, which means as you get closer to the bar, there's less leverage being actuated, and therefore less power going into the brake, so to speak. Now, this is how it works for quite a lot of systems, but there are notable exceptions. For instance, Shimano's Servo Wave, the reason it feels so much more positive is because it's got a cam in there. And what that does essentially gives you the short kind of levers, but the cam actually really just dishes out the power on your behalf. Now, this is really good in terms of ultimate power, but it does give that on and off feeling, which isn't to everyone's taste. It's something that I think it's great, but it's horses for courses, and like I said, it's a compromise in every regard. So actually there, if you look at the leverage curve, I'm pretty sure, I saw a diagram a couple of years ago, and it was saying how the amount of power actuated on the brake in the last part of the stroke actually really ramps up with Shimano, and that's why you get something that feels so positive. So the next question is from Crazy Duck, with capital letters going off everywhere. Nice. I've been thinking about a new bike. All the people around me say I should go for a short to medium travel trail bike. I'm more inclined to go for a 170mm bike. I find they pedal well enough for the climbs around here, and I have been vigorously researching. Cool. Sounds like you've got an idea of what you want. Now, do you think that enduro bikes really climb really that much harder to pedal around? I've seen situations where a 15-minute climb on the enduro bike is about 30 seconds behind the top, which doesn't seem too bad to me. So again, are enduro bikes really that heinous to climb with? Now, that's a great question. it's really dependent where you live. I actually find that, gear ranges are so wide now. We have such small low gears, and seat angles are steeper, etc. And you've got, great climbing platforms on your suspension units. That, to be honest, I kind of agree with you. I don't think they do make that much difference. For me, the difference is in, when you actually go up something very steep, an enduro bike can give you a really comfortable climbing position because the front end is quite high. You can just, the seat angle could be quite steep, and you've got big chunky tyres and a low range. It's basically like a low range gearbox on there, so you can scramble up a lot of things. The issue is, for me, is when you get to tighter, twistier stuff that isn't just a case of winching up a fire road or indeed undulating terrain. The benefit for me from riding a short travel bike isn't in climbing, it's actually in descending. It makes it feel, it's the difference between a rapier and a broadsword. It feels a bit more nimble, a bit more, fun and responsive, and it lets the trail give me back so much more. I think the other thing I'd say is, in regards to the way bikes climb, if we come back to what a lot of people do, which is, power to weight, assuming that you want to spec your 130mm trail bike to ride with people with enduro bikes, I tend to put big tyres on and bigger brakes and, same cockpit, and, everything's basically the same, except maybe a slightly more slender fork or a lighter fork option. So there really isn't that much in it. I think I would go on to say that actually, for me, being somebody that is quite happy to pedal, when I'm pedaling by myself, I don't care how fast I go up, and when I pedal with friends who are, especially when I was living, doing the seasons and stuff, a lot of people would be riding a lot of bike parking, but be absolutely rapid on the descents, but meant to be that fit. So I would find actually I'd be happily ride a big enduro bike, just if only to when you got one bike, to give you as much versatility when descending as possible, especially when you're riding with people that are just absolutely rapid and you're just, clutching at straws to try and keep up. If I were to have one bike, so I'm very long answer here. If I were to have one bike, I would probably lean towards the 150, 160 enduro bike. I think it is truly versatile, and if you sling some light tyres on, you'd be amazed at how well they climb as well. The next question is from Matty, and they say, "Hi guys, I'm thinking of purchasing a new bike and I'm stuck between an orange bike trail bike, the Orange 5 Pro, and another model of the Trek Fuel EX. My question is, what are the pros and cons of having a single pivot bike, and what are the pros and cons of a multiple pivot bike?" If you asked a single pivot rider what they would say, some people would point towards less maintenance, which I think is kind of a cop-out, if I'm honest with you, because I want to ride a bike that really is maintenance. It should be a consideration, of course, but if that's the first point, that's never my priority. I'm more concerned with the riding characteristic. A company like Orange have made non-single pivot bikes, but they have settled on the single pivot design because, well, that's just what they like, and it gives them the ride characteristic they want. So when you get a single pivot, it means it's very linear. So that means that the leverage actuated from the rear wheel, and the mechanical advantage it has over the shock is consistent through the travel. Now what that means is that you might find, depending on how you set up the bike, it doesn't have that much bottom out resistance. Or, if you go for a coil spring, you might find that maybe you go through the mid-stroke a bit more than you want. The Trek, if you think about it, actually has a swing arm too. The chainstay is connected at one end to the axle and at one end to the front triangle. So when you look at something like that, that isn't quite the same thing as something like a 4-bar, which has is interrupted by a pivot. Although obviously the Trek does have a split pivot on the back. Now what that means is that actually the riding characteristics probably aren't as different as you think, because the Trek is going to be, I imagine it's going to be quite consistently progressive, so the line will be coming down like that, and if memory serves, I believe the Trek systems tend to go slightly regressive, or definitely flattens out towards the end. Now that might mean that you don't have quite as much bottom out resistance, but the really important thing here is shock setup and actually choosing a coil or an air to suit your needs. A single pivot with the air shock on can actually really complement each other, because it means that the leverage curve's always the same, and it means that you can use that ramp up of the air spring to give you just the right amount of support, irrespective of where you travel. In the same way that, when you talk about forks, you don't have the complication of linkage, or at least in most circumstances. So you can just focus on that aspect, and you can fine tune it to get what you want. Similar with, with our rear suspension, you can use a coil, which will give you something super linear, and that might work. It just depends. I think that yes, linkage obviously does offer lots of different ride characteristics, but maximising it with shock setup and shock choice is absolutely vital. Both could ride absolutely fantastic. Both could ride not so much if they don't have the setup to suit. But that is it for this week's Ask GMBN Tech questions. Thank you very much for everyone who took the time to write a question. And if you've got your own question, please don't hesitate to get in the comments using the hashtag AskGMBNTech, and hopefully I can answer it on one of these shows. Thanks guys, and we'll see you next time.